Have you ever compared or A/B'd one of your music productions with a commercially released track and wondered why it doesn't quite sound as good? I know I have on numerous occasions, and in this video I want to look at why that is, but I also want to give you some concrete steps that you can start taking today to start improving the quality of your productions, raising the bar and closing that gap between what you're producing and the stuff that you're hearing broadcast on TV and in film. Hi there, my name's Jim Huswit from LARP Music. I'm a composer and music producer. I write music for TV and film, I produce artists, and I do quite a lot of production music. And one of the big challenges that I face on a daily basis, and I think we generally as composers and producers face, is that we have clients that want us to produce and compose music which sounds like it was recorded by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra at Abbey Road, but they don't necessarily want to pay the money that would allow us to do so. So we have to turn to virtual studio technology, or VSTs, essentially incredibly well sampled instruments from brass to orchestral that we can load into our DAW, assign to our keyboard, and play as if we had an orchestra at our fingertips. Now, VSTs are incredible and they are getting better all the time, but I liken it to CGI in movies. As good as it gets, you know it's not real. And the same is set true for VSTs. Even if the listener on a conscious level doesn't know that it's not real, they feel something's missing. So the challenge we face is, how do we take those VSTs and try and add the energy that's missing, add the performance level that's missing? And in this video, I'm going to be talking about what I do on a daily basis to try and make my MIDI as real world and magical as possible. Point number one is programming. The way you program your MIDI goes a really long way to determining how good the end product will be. If you program your MIDI as if you're sitting in your bedroom in your underpants, it will sound like you programmed it sitting in your bedroom in your underpants. You have to perform and program that MIDI as if you were playing to an audience. So recreating that is a hugely important part of decent programming. I used to go to panel shows in London all the time, and I would listen to a panel of top producers, and they will always talk about the importance of capturing a good performance. And that is the hallmark of an amazing producer. It's somebody who is able to get the best out of an artist or a musician and create and capture an amazing performance. As producers and composers doing our own music, the onus is on us to make sure that we program it well and we give a performance that is beyond sitting in a home studio. Now, I can almost hear some people groaning as I say this, because people are going to go, yeah, but Jim, it's not going to make much of a difference. Okay, so imagine this. Imagine in that track, let's say for argument's sake that you performing it well adds a 2% improvement in the overall product. That's not that much. Over 20 tracks, that 2% measures up to 40%. So that's a 40% improvement. So this is the game we're in when we're producing or when we're mixing. We're making small improvements on a track by track basis, which over time, those increments add up to a big, big difference. Point number two is quantizing. So let's say we've programmed our perfect piano performance, and what do we want to do? We want to quantize it and suck the life out of it. No! For those of you who don't know, quantizing is an incredible function which exists in all DAWs, which allows us to correct slight timing imperfections. But it can also run the risk of sucking the life out of a piece of music. So overly quantizing something is something that should absolutely be avoided. Obviously, if you're doing electronic music like EDM, then you are going to be hard quantizing to grid. So all this talk about performance and groove is probably not quite so relevant. However, any other type of music, whether it be rock, pop, funk, indie, classical, feeling, emotion, performance is a really, really important part of it. So we need to quantize sparingly. I run a course called the Sync Accelerator, which is designed to help producers and composers write tracks which work perfectly to picture. And some of the initial submissions that I get often have major timing issues in them. Now, there is a very fine line between groove and timing issues. Groove is what I call those slight timing imperfections which you get when a human being plays an instrument and is really feeling what they're playing. Timing imperfections, or mistakes, are when instruments are fighting against each other rather than complementing each other. So my first suggestion when I hear those mistakes is, don't rely on Quantize to fix it. Go back and reprogram it or re-record it, because Quantize shouldn't be fixing major mistakes. It should be enhancing what's there. It should be taking a good performance and just tweaking it so it just sits in the pocket nicely. So you'd be hard pushed to find a commercial release which hasn't had some kind of quantizing done to it. However, it's been done sparingly. And my first suggestion is if you are going to quantize something, do it manually. So rather than relying on the algorithm, listen with your ears and listen for any slight timing issues and go in and manually do it. Yes, it takes more time and yes, it's a bit more laborious, but the end result is much more natural sounding. So if you can't be asked to do it manually, and I get it, sometimes it is a painstaking, laborious process, and you insist on using the algorithm, the key is to make sure you don't use 100% quantized strength. So you quantize it and then reduce the strength. In Logic, it's called the Q strength. You reduce the percentage by which it's actually quantizing it. So rather than snapping the note exactly to grid, it just moves it a bit closer. And obviously at 100%, it's on grid, but as you reduce the percentage, it's moving a bit further and further away. And that is a really good way to make sure that your MIDI retains some of that natural performance. Tip number 3 is layering. Layering is by far the most important element to making sure that your track sounds as real as possible. And I'm talking about layering in at least one real instrument. So in a production which is like 100% MIDI, if you can layer in one guitar or one vocal or even some shakers that you actually play in yourself, it humanizes it and it tricks the listener's ear into thinking that everything is much more real than it actually is. So one area where layering comes into its own is with strings. So if I'm working on a piece of music which has strings, maybe it's an orchestral part or it's just sort of strings for a pop track, I will program the strings with MIDI, but I will always get in at least one violinist in to double up the strings and multi-track the top string line, which I'll then mix in with the program strings. It brings the strings to life. It's night and day. In fact, I've done a video on this, which I'll link to in the description below, where I talk about an A-B, program strings versus real strings. But if you can't afford an orchestra or you can't even afford a quartet, just getting in one violinist to double up and multi-track the same part and then mix that in with your program strings will be a huge game changer. One little thing to look out for when you are multi-tracking and layering in strings is if you record the same violinist playing the same violin in the same room and you record them with the same microphone, layering those takes becomes problematic because they all sound so similar. So try and get them to change their bow, or if they've got a second violin, bring in that violin, or maybe change the microphone. I think I'll probably do a video on actually how I go about multi-tracking strings to layer in with MIDI, but that's for a different time. So tip number 4 is ambience. The people that record samples for our use are generally recording them quite close, so they're close miking the sample, but they're also recording it in a space where there's little or no reverb whatsoever. Now the problem with that is we hardly ever in the real world hear a sound that doesn't have some kind of ambience or reverb associated with it. So when we hear something that's completely dry, it just sounds fake. So one thing you can do with sampled instruments which have no reverb whatsoever is just add a little bit of ambience. So I'm talking about a reverb which has lots of early reflections, but also about 0.1 to 0.89 millisecond delay. Because what that does is, first of all, it pushes it back from the microphone a bit, or gives the impression it's been pushed back from the microphone, which is nice because we don't always want something close mic'd, but it also then creates a natural space for the sound to exist in, which, as I say, we never hear anything that doesn't exist in a space. So that just again goes a long way to making that very dry sample sound a little bit more real. So my final tip is distortion. So I've talked a lot in this video about imperfections. So whether that's imperfections in timing, which creates the groove, or performance, but also as human beings, we seem very predisposed to liking sonic imperfections. All you have to do is look at the plugin emulations that are on every mix that you hear at the moment. All of those emulations are of analog gear that was made in the 60s and 70s. And why do we like the analog gear that was made in the 60s and 70s? Because it goes through circuitry, and as it does so, it creates color, it creates tone, it creates saturation, it creates harmonic distortion. We like those little imperfections. So when we're dealing with MIDI, what's been sampled and made to sound as perfect as possible in a pure environment, automatically we're not predisposed to liking that. We want it to sound a bit crunchy, a bit different, a bit interesting. So applying distortion to your MIDI samples is a great way to just take them out of the MIDI realm and make them a bit more interesting in real world. I'm not generally in the business of advocating any particular plugins, but I seem to use the Soundtoys Decapitator on pretty much everything, almost to the point where it's a bit of an addiction and I probably need to get some different plugins. Hopefully that was useful for you. As I say, all of these tips and tricks are things which I employ on a daily basis to try and elevate my tracks to sounding like they weren't just programmed or recorded in this room, but were recorded at Abbey Road. So let me know how you get on using them. Please post in the comments below. If you've got any questions or any problems and you want to sort of highlight them, then put them in the comments below. I will respond. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, because that goes some way to telling Google that this video is worth watching. But also hit the subscribe and the bell icon, because that way next time I post, you'll be the first to know. Thanks very much for watching. Keep making music.